On September 3, 2024, a New York bank seized control of TGI Fridays, not its stock, but its very name. The trustee for $375 million in bonds had just fired the 59-year-old chain from running its own brand. It was the kind of move Wall Street hadn't seen since the financial crisis. Why? Because the people managing TGI Fridays had quietly paid themselves around $2 million out of the very trust that owned the restaurant's name. And when they were asked to give it back, according to analysts who reviewed the bond documents, they returned barely $200,000 of it. This is the story of how two Wall Street firms bought a 59-year-old American giant for nearly $900 million, borrowed against its own brand until there was nothing left to borrow, and tried 3 times to escape. It is the story of how that escape failed in 6 days, how the company went bankrupt in 6 weeks, and how $50 million in gift cards became worthless paper. Hundreds of restaurants went dark. Workers were locked out without a single day's notice. And from a peak of more than 600 American restaurants, only 85 would survive. This is who got rich while TGI Fridays fell. To understand how it ended, you have to start with how American it once was. In 1965, a 28-year-old perfume salesman named Alan Stillman wanted to meet the flight attendants and models who lived in his Upper East Side neighborhood. So he took $10,000, half of it his own savings, half of it borrowed from his mother, and opened a bar on the corner of 63rd Street and 1st Avenue in Manhattan. He painted it red and white, hung up striped awnings, and gave it a name that sounded like a celebration. Thank God it's Friday. It became something bigger than a bar. Lines wrapped around the block. Newsweek would later call it the birthplace of the singles scene. Stillman had accidentally invented a template, the loud, friendly, slightly theatrical American restaurant, where the whole point was that the weekend had arrived. Within a decade, the concept was too big for one man. In 1975, the Carlson Companies, a Minnesota conglomerate, bought TGI Fridays when it had just a dozen locations and turned it into a national franchise machine. For the next 30 years, Fridays was everywhere. The flair pinned to the suspenders, the Jack Daniels glaze, the loaded potato skins that half of casual dining would go on to copy. It was the place you went for a birthday, a first date, a celebration after the big game. By 2008, there were roughly 601 restaurants in the United States and more than 900 worldwide, ringing up billions in system-wide sales. TGI Fridays didn't just sell food. It sold the feeling of Friday night to a country that wanted one. It was, by any honest measure, a giant. And giants eventually get put up for sale. In November 2013, Carlson announced it wanted out of the restaurant business. The brand it was selling was mature, slowing, yes, but throwing off enormous dependable cash. That cash is exactly what private equity is built to hunt. In May 2014, 2 firms stepped forward. Sentinel Capital Partners, with Triartisan Capital Partners as a minority partner, agreed to buy TGI Fridays for around $890 million. But here is the part that matters, the part that decides everything that follows. They did not pay $890 million of their own money. By most accounts, the firms put up only about a quarter of the price in actual equity. The rest, roughly 2/3 of $1 billion, was debt, and in a leveraged buyout, that debt does not sit on the private equity firm's balance sheet. It is loaded onto the company that was just purchased. TGI Fridays, the restaurant chain, now owed the money borrowed to buy TGI Fridays. The cooks and the servers and the franchise owners would spend the next decade generating cash to pay down a loan that made other people the owners. This is the engine of the whole story. The buyer takes a small risk. The company takes the debt. And the clock starts the day the papers are signed. For a while, the math can work. As long as sales hold and interest rates stay low, you can service the debt and even pull money out. But it leaves no room for a bad year. And it created a powerful incentive to do the one thing that defines this entire genre of collapse, to find ways to turn the brand itself into cash. In 2017, Triartisan reached for the most sophisticated tool in the box. It is called a whole business securitization, and once you understand it, you understand Fridays, and as we'll see, you understand Hooters too. Here's how it works. A restaurant brand's most valuable possession isn't its kitchens or its real estate. It's the franchise royalties, the steady percentage of sales that every franchised location pays, year after year, just to use the name. In a whole business securitization, you bundle those future royalties and the brand's intellectual property into a separate legal vehicle. For Fridays, that vehicle was called TGIF Funding LLC. Then you sell bonds backed by that royalty stream to institutional investors and collect the cash up front. All told, the securitization raised an estimated $425 million this way. And by the time the whole structure finally came apart, $375 million in bonds were still outstanding. In plain terms, the owners had mortgaged the brand's own name. Every future Friday night dollar was now promised to bondholders before it could be reinvested in the restaurants. According to the financial research firm Octus, formerly Reorg, this structure carried a built-in conflict. The private equity manager running the company had interests that could diverge sharply from the bondholders it now owed. And where did that borrowed cash go? The firms almost certainly used much of it to refinance the original buyout debt, the standard private equity move of using a brand's own future earnings to help repay the very money borrowed to buy the brand in the first place. The exact figures were never disclosed, but the pattern is unmistakable. Every layer of this structure was designed to pull value forward, into the present, for the people at the top. For 3 years, the structure held. Then, in the second quarter of 2020, the pandemic emptied every dining room in America. System-wide sales crashed through a critical trigger, a $1.5 billion floor written into the bond agreement. The moment they breached it, the securitization flipped into something called rapid amortization. From that point on, cash didn't flow to the restaurants first. It flowed to the bondholders first. The brand was now feeding its own mortgage before it could feed itself. The strain showed at the top. In a single year, 2023, TGI Fridays cycled through 3 different chief executives. Leadership churned while the debt clock kept ticking, and the dining rooms kept getting quieter. By now, the only thing TriArtisan and its partners really wanted was a way out, a buyer to take the whole thing off their hands so they could book a return and move on. And this is the strip mining spine of the story, because they tried to escape 3 separate times. Each attempt is a snapshot of how much value had already drained away. The first attempt came in 2019. TGI Fridays announced a deal to go public through a SPAC, a blank check company called Allegro Merger Corp., at an enterprise value of around $448 million. Notice that number. Just 5 years after paying $890 million, the implied value had already nearly halved. Then COVID arrived in 2020 and killed the deal entirely. The exit slammed shut. Around this same period, Sentinel, the majority owner, sold its stake to TriArtisan and stepped away, leaving TriArtisan holding the bag alone. There was one more asset to monetize on the way down. In May 2024, the company struck a perpetual licensing deal with Kraft Heinz to sell TGI Fridays branded frozen appetizers in grocery stores across North America. Restaurant Business reported it as an asset sale to help pay down debt, value being peeled off the brand and sold for cash even as the restaurants themselves were starving. The second great escape attempt came in April 2024. TriArtisan struck a deal with Hostmore, a company listed on the London Stock Exchange that operated the Fridays restaurants in Britain. The plan was a reverse merger. Hostmore would absorb the American company, and the combined business would trade publicly in London as TGI Fridays plc. The valuation this time? Around $220 million, from $890 million in 2014 to $220 million a decade later, a collapse of roughly 75%. The leverage buyout hadn't built value, it had destroyed it. And while the company was scrambling for that last exit, management did the small, self-destructive thing we started with. They overpaid themselves about $2 million out of the bond trust, withheld certain fees that were owed to it, and deferred royalties. It was, in the scheme of things, a tiny amount of money, but it broke the one rule the bondholders could not forgive. On September 3, 2024, Citibank, the trustee for the bonds, terminated TGI Fridays as the manager of its own brand and handed control of the royalty stream to the consulting firm FTI. It was, analysts noted, the first time a whole business securitization manager had been fired this way since the financial crisis. The owners no longer control the asset they had spent a decade mortgaging. The dominoes fell fast. 6 days later, on September 9th, the Housemoor deal was dead. Housemoor's shares cratered more than 90% in London. Within weeks, the British company entered administration. 35 sites closed and more than 1,000 UK workers, 1,012 of them, lost their jobs, while a rescue buyer salvaged 51 sites and around 2,400 positions. In America, the end was uglier. Around October 24th, roughly 50 TGI Fridays restaurants closed their doors, and, according to a class action lawsuit, employees were given no warning at all, in apparent violation of the federal VORN Act that requires 60 days' notice for mass layoffs. 8 days later, on November 2nd, 2024, TGI Fridays Incorporated and 22 affiliated companies filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the Northern District of Texas. The numbers in that filing tell you who mattered and who didn't. The company had $5.9 million in cash, and it had $49.7 million in unredeemed gift cards, some of them dating back to 2003, that it could no longer comfortably honor. Those gift cards were essentially dumped onto the franchisees, the independent operators who still ran most of the restaurants. People who'd received a Friday's gift card for a birthday or a Christmas were, in the eyes of the bankruptcy, near the back of the line. The brand was sold off for scraps. A Mexican operator called Mera paid $34.5 million for 9 of the best locations, including prized airport restaurants. A second round of sales brought in only a few million more for 19 others. The company that once had 601 American restaurants would shrink to around 85 by the spring of 2025, a fall of roughly 86% from its peak. A brand that took 59 years to build was dismantled, location by location, in a matter of months. So, who got rich? The bondholders, who held the mortgage on the brand, negotiated their recoveries first. The lawyers, the financial advisors, the restructuring consultants, the people who always get paid in a bankruptcy, got paid. The private equity firm's equity was wiped out, but the structure they built had spent a decade extracting cash, refinancing debt, and chasing a profitable exit. The workers fired without notice. The franchisees stuck with worthless gift cards. The British shareholders who lost 90% in a single day. They were the ones left holding nothing. And here's the detail that turns this from a single failure into a pattern. The firm at the center of it, Tri-Artisan, owned another beloved American chain. A chain it had bought the same year, run the same way, and mortgaged with the very same kind of securitization. 5 months before TGI Fridays filed for bankruptcy, that other chain had already begun its own collapse. Its name was Hooters, and its story is almost exactly the same.